I'm really glad you're here. Um, just take a breath, settle in a little bit, and get ready. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive today and probably the next at least two Tuesdays talking about basically the same case. Um, and it's just really interesting, and we're going to take it from like a center viewpoint. And so I'm really excited you're here. Just take a listen. August 16th, 1991 began this the way southern summer days often do, with a brief moment of mercy. At sunrise, Talladega sat at 64 degrees, cool enough that the air felt gentle and forgiving. It was the kind of morning where the light comes in low and gold, brushing over rooftops and trees, warming the pavement but not yet living in it. But that softness wouldn't last long. By late morning, the heat had settled in. 88 degrees, dry, bright, and unbothered. No rain in sight. No clouds gathering, just a long stretch of blue sky. The kind that sharpens shadows and makes the asphalt outside start to smell like heat. It was the kind of day where everyone's and everything looks ordinary. Clear, predictable. A day where people run errands, pick up parts from the auto parts store, clock in and clock out. A day where nothing in the weather hints at what's coming. And yet, on that bright, dry, ordinary Friday in Talladega, something happened inside an AutoZone that would echo for decades. This is the story of the lives that were changed that day and what it has to do with the space between. 6 men walked into the Talladega AutoZone that day with one intention: to rob it. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't sophisticated, it was a plan built on desperation, impulse, and the kind of short sighted thinking that turns a few minutes into a lifetime. According to his own statements, Charles Burton went straight to the back of the store. He opened the safe, took the money, and then stepped outside, leaving the others behind as he moved towards the getaway car. In his version of events, his part was over. He was out of the building, and he was waiting. But inside, the situation was shifting. Derek DeBruce, one of the other men involved in the robbery, confronted a customer whose name was Doug Battle. During the chaos of the robbery, witnesses later described DeBruce knocking him down. Moments after Burton had already exited the store, DeBruce shot Battle in the back. Doug Battle would not survive. Those few minutes, the robbery, the choices, the violence, would ripple outward for many years, changing countless lives along the way. There would be 3 death sentences handed down in this case. One for Doug Battle, the man who happened to be shopping at the wrong place at the wrong time. One for Derek DeBruce, the man who pulled the trigger. And one for Charles Sonny Burton, the man who was already outside waiting beside the getaway car. 3 lives, 3 trajectories, 3 outcomes that would all be defined by the same few minutes inside a Talladega AutoZone. The law would treat those minutes as equal, even though the roles inside of them were not. This podcast isn't going to be just about what happened inside that AutoZone. It's about the lives that collided there, and the long, complicated space between intention and outcome, guilt and responsibility, punishment and truth. The legal doctrine that shaped this case, the one that allowed a man waiting outside to receive the same sentence as the man who pulled the trigger, isn't unique to Alabama. Versions of it exist at the federal level too. They were built during the era of fear, extremism, and political pressure, when lawmakers believed the only way to stop violence was to cast the widest possible net. It's the kind of law we try to avoid here in the space between, not because accountability doesn't matter, but because these laws often ignore the difference between what someone did and what someone else did, between presence and intent, between participation and responsibility. And I couldn't help but do a cast on it, because the case is a perfect example of how a law designed to be tough on crime can end up flattening nuance, erasing context, and sometimes punishing people in ways that even the victim's own family later question. We know the space between wouldn't exist without the extremes on both sides of it: the shouting, the certainty, the all or nothing thinking. That's the world we're living in. But today, we get to be grateful for the people who stand in the middle, for the ones who speak quietly about the truth and fairness, even when the world around them is loud. For the ones who don't bend to the pressure of choosing a side, but instead choose what is ultimately right. And in this case, the people standing in the middle didn't just include family members or advocates or strangers watching from the outside. It included the very people who once held Burton's life in their hands. Years later, some of the jurors who voted for his death sentence would look back and say they were young when they served. They were overwhelmed. They didn't fully understand the laws they were applying. And with time, they admitted they would not make the same decision again. That matters. Because when even the jurors, the people chosen to represent the community, look back and say, we didn't get that right, it forces us to ask what justice really means. Two days before Sonny Burton was scheduled to die, something happened that almost never happens in Alabama. Governor Kay Ivey commuted his death sentence in a state with one of the most aggressive execution records in the country, in a state where clemency is almost never granted, in a state where governors historically let the courts speak for them. Kay Ivey stepped in and said, no, not this time. And that alone is extraordinary. Alabama governors have granted clemency to death row inmates only a handful of times in modern history. It is not routine, it's not expected, and it's not politically safe. And it's almost never done for someone convicted under the felony murder or accomplice liability doctrine, the very doctrine that put Charles Sonny Burton on death row, even though he didn't pull the trigger. But here's the part that matters most, the part that tells you this wasn't just a political calculation or a legal correction. The victim's own daughter did not want Burton executed. She was 9 years old when her father, Doug Battle, was killed. She grew up carrying the weight of that loss. She grew up with the stories and the grief and the empty chair at the table and at every event and everything that she did in her life where she would want her dad there. When she became an adult, when she had the language and the clarity to speak for herself, she said she didn't want the state to kill Burton for her father's death. And that matters. It matters because she's the person with the most moral authority in the room. It matters because she had every reason to demand the harshest punishment, and she didn't. It matters because she saw that the system refused to see for decades, that Burton was not the man who killed her father, and executing him would not bring justice any closer. And Governor Ivey listened. Governor Ivey said that she could not, in good conscience, allow the state to execute Burton when the man who actually fired the fatal shot, which again was Derek DeBruce, had already had his death sentence reduced to life. She called the disparity unjust. She called it disproportionate. She called it something she could not proceed with. And in Alabama, that kind of language from a sitting governor is almost unheard of. And Kay Ivey isn't some person who normally typically does these things. Like I said, it's unheard of. And it's unheard of from her as well. Not just any governor. This wasn't a legal technicality. This wasn't a procedural correction. This was a moral decision, one that cut against decades of political precedent in the state. When Burton heard the news, when he learned that he would not be strapped to a gurney that week, that he would not die by the state's hand, he said it was, quote, a gift from God. Not a loophole, not a victory, not a second chance at freedom, just a gift. The gift of life continuing even from behind bars. And that response tells you something about the man and about the weight of the moment, because clemency didn't erase his sentence. It didn't set him free. It didn't undo the decades he spent on death row. But it did acknowledge something the system had refused to see for 33 years. That the punishment no longer matched the person. That the truth mattered. That proportionality mattered. That justice, real justice, sometimes requires stepping into the middle and saying this isn't right. And that's what happened in those final hours. A rare moment of clarity, A rare moment of courage. A rare moment where the state of Alabama chose the middle instead of the edge. So why does it still matter? Burton's still going to die in prison. Mr. Battle is still dead from being shot in the back in that AutoZone. DeBruce died in prison. So why does it matter? Because the point isn't whether or not a man dies in prison. The point is how the state chooses to punish him and what that says about us. Burton's original sentence wasn't reasonable once Burton's original sentence wasn't reasonable once the shooter's sentence was reduced. It wasn't proportional, it wasn't consistent, it wasn't rooted in the truth of what actually happened inside that store. And it matters because the people closest to the harm, the victim's daughter, the jurors who once voted for that death, they grew up, they looked back, and they said, we didn't get this right. That kind of honesty is rare. That kind of clarity is brave. That kind of middle space truth is exactly why this podcast exists. So, as we close today, I keep coming back to this. Justice isn't only about outcomes. It's about the path we take to get there. It's about whether the punishment matches the person's actual role. It's about whether the system can tell the difference between the man who pulled the trigger and the man who was already outside. It's about whether we're willing to revisit decisions when new clarity emerges. Burton will still die in prison. But the meaning of his sentence, the fairness, the proportionality, the truth, it still matters. And it challenges us to decide who we want to be now. So, as we step out of this episode, I'm grateful truly for the people who stand in the middle, for the ones who speak quietly about truth and fairness, the ones who the ones who refuse the extremes, the ones who remind us that justice isn't a destination, but it's a practice, and that practice lives here, in the space between. So, there's a lot more to this case. I didn't want to get into the gritty details about, detail upon detail. I don't want to glorify crime. That's not what this is. The story here is that our justice system allowed someone who had never been, just imagine if it were you. You're stupid in making a decision that involves you robbing an AutoZone. You go in, you go to the back, you get the money, you leave. You think, okay, good. The worst thing that can happen to me is I get a robbery charge for, I don't know, whatever amount of money was stolen. But if you're Steve Burton, I'm sorry, not Steve, Charles Burton, if you're Charles Burton, that's not what happens. What happens is, even though you weren't even in the building when someone died, there's a law in the books that says that you can be charged with murder equal to the person who actually committed the crime. I will tell you that next Tuesday we're going to be talking about, I told you that there were 6 men that went into that store. We're going to be talking about the other 4 and what we can learn from the other 4 men as far as what we can get from the space between. Not the extremes of it, but the space between. I don't know. It's crazy to think that we live in a country where there are 48 states and Washington, D.C. that have some form of this law in the books. And we're going to talk some more about that, for the reasons behind that. If you can guess or care to wager a guess as to why those laws might exist beyond the bare basics of they're trying to, fearmonger and use that as a way to prevent crime. So, like I said, next Tuesday we will talk. Part two of this series is going to be on the other four men and what we can learn from them and uh, their participation and involvement in this situation. And then following that, it's going to kind of be the closeout to this particular series, and we're going to talk about the why, and really kind of draw in some really intense questions about this this law that's on the books in 48 states in the United States. So, if you enjoy this kind of content, this kind of storytelling about crimes that are happening, let me know. I have a lot of deep dives that I'm doing right now into really interesting stories. Like most people, I'm kind of a super fan of like true crime, and I always have questions after, like, if I listen to a podcast or if I watch something on TV, like Evil Lives Here or something like that. Like, I always want to know more. I always have questions. I always, you know, wonder what happened next, what happened after, what's the other side of the story. And so it's been really kind of fun for me to get to do that in this realm. And so I have a couple different people that I'm looking into and kind of doing some deep dives and trying to figure out how to look at it from this perspective of not left, not right, not judgmental, but just like, what can we learn from this situation? What can we take from this situation to be better human beings? Because ultimately that's the goal, right? Is we want to be better humans. We want to come at things from this centered point of view, um, and just kind of share what we think and what we're learning. So if you enjoyed today, definitely hit that like button, or leave a comment. If there's any cases that you would like me to talk to you a little bit more about, give you the backstory behind some more, I can definitely do that. So just let me know if this piqued your interest. And like I said, the follow up to this will be next Tuesday at the same time. We hope to see you there. Bye.